just sitting and breaking bread with them.
Wow.
And then after the meal, you sit around a fire, and some of the Moroccans who are with us will play instruments and tell
Mm,
stories. And it's
wow.
just such a beautiful experience where you're really disconnected and it's just you and the desert and the people that you're with.
Welcome to the Cross Cultural Site podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here's Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
Sara Shaban is a critical cultural scholar focused on the intersections between media, women's social movements, and geopolitics in the Middle East. Shaban's academic work is rooted within the theoretical frameworks of transnationalism and femonationalism. Her award-winning research is published in the International Journal of Communication and Critical Cultural Studies. She recently published her first book, Iranian Feminism and Transnational Ethics in Media Discourse. Prior to life in academia, Shaban worked in U.S. local news as a producer before pursuing freelance journalism in Israel, the West Bank, and Sierra Leone. Shaban is fueled by her passion for social justice, specifically for immigrants and refugees. She was involved in initiatives to improve conditions for incoming refugees during the 2015 crisis and served as a volunteer and board member for the Immigrant and Refugee Women's Program in St. Louis. Additionally, she served as the communications director for the St. Louis-based NGO Project Peanut Butter, an organization committed to the eradication of child malnutrition throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Lots of amazing things you're doing. Sarah, welcome, and thanks for being a guest on my podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
So excited to chat with you. I'll jump into the questions right away. As you know, you and I lead study abroad programs at our current institution, and I would love to exchange ideas and stories about this aspect of our jobs. So, before anything, could you tell my listeners about your study abroad program?
Absolutely. I actually was able to co-lead my very first study abroad to Morocco in
Mm,
December of 2022.
mm,
And we just had that unique break between the fall and the winter quarter. So the program usually lasts about 3 weeks.
mm,
And because sometimes we do it in September,
mhm,
but this particular time we did it in December. So it lasts about 3 weeks.
mhm,
And we are based in a town called Meknes in Morocco. And the students do homestays. So they each stay with different families. And we spend about 2 weeks there where we do classes. I teach media and representation. Dr. Siegel teaches Arab Spring, gender, Islam, and democracy.
mm.
So they have the opportunity to take one or both of those classes. They also actually take a Arabic class as well with
Wow.
a local teacher. So
Mm,
they, of course, they're not fluent by the end of it, but they get the opportunity to start learning Arabic with someone there. So we
mm,
we stay in Meknes for 2 weeks,
mhm,
and then we basically go on a road trip for the last like 10 days or so.
mm,
So we go to Fez, we go through the Merzouga Desert, which I'm
mm,
sure we'll talk about.
mm.
We go to Ouarzazate, to Marrakesh, and to Essaouira before we fly back. So we're able to hit a lot of places.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm already hearing, Sarah, a lot of cool things, including co-teaching, which I in my experience, I feel like I would really benefit from a co-teaching experience because, as you know, sometimes the study abroad, leading it can be a very lonely experience. And then the other part that's really cool is the language experience. It's impressive that you're able to do that and to offer that to the students. What do the students, what are their responses like to that aspect of the study abroad?
I think it's exciting for them. Again, no one's expecting them to be fluent by the end of the
Mhm,
trip by any means. Before we actually go on the trip, we teach them a few
mhm,
common Arabic phrases. I actually don't speak Arabic fluently, but I speak enough of it.
right.
And then when they first get there, we actually, one of the first things we do is a language exchange. So we
Mm,
partner them with some local college students in Meknes, and those students are learning English. And so they both get to kind of figure out how to communicate even though there's a language barrier. And so
Mm,
that's really interesting for them to be in a place where their language isn't the dominant language,
mm,
which is it's exciting. So they respond really well to it. I think they have fun in the Arabic classes. In their homestays, sometimes their families only speak Arabic. And so that language immersion, it gets them when that's the fastest way to learn a language is just to throw them into it. And so in my experience, everyone's embraced it. And everybody's just so kind and welcoming there that it's just been a great experience for them.
yeah, yeah. Wow. Again, super impressive that you're able to do that. As you know, I lead the South Korea study abroad, and I certainly don't have them do any kind of language learning during the trip. It's about 3 weeks, like yours. But I do encourage them to learn the essential phrases before they go, and also to utilize many online resources that are available for them to learn the phrases. What's really cool is that sometimes students, they just take it upon themselves to learn how to read and write in Korean, which is really
That's
impressive.
impressive.
Yeah. And they might not know what it means, but they can like look at a sign and read it out loud. And so, yeah, it just and when I've had students who are like just inherently interested in the academic side of language, and that's been really enriching for them to be part
Mhm.
of this psychology class experience as well. I think what's also interesting to me, Sarah, is that you're describing 2 weeks of class and then 1 week of sort of full-time traveling. Do you like that setup where maybe the first 2 weeks are not necessarily involving like any kind of long-term travel, if you will, but and then you reserve sort of that intense traveling for the last week. Am I understanding that setup correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
We do a couple of day trips
Mm,
during that 2-week excursion. We usually
yeah.
do class in the morning and maybe explore the city
Mm,
or do market excursions and whatnot. But what I really like about that setup is that it's almost like putting theory into practice. Like, okay, we've talked about it. Now let's see what it's like to put that into play in reality.
mm. Yeah. So almost preparing for the more intense experience. Yeah. Um,
Exactly. And it is a very fast paced experience. We
yes.
do camp out in the desert for 2 days.
Oh my
So
goodness. That
it's it's good for them to build up to that point.
right, right. I I want to come back to that camping out in the desert experience because I'm sure you have lots of stories to tell. But in terms of helping students prepare for the country that they're visiting, whether it's Morocco, whether it's South Korea, how do you go about doing that? And specifically, in my experience teaching at a Christian higher ed institution, so many students have experiences going on mission trips where they were part of these short term mission trips that, frankly, I think some of them didn't set a good example of what it means to do these cross-cultural experiences. So I'm curious, like if you had any thoughts regarding how you went about preparing students well so that they can be respectful, so that they can take away more than just being a tourist from this kind of a trip. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm,
So one of the big parts of the course that I teach, media and representation, two of the concepts that we focus on are hegemony and intersectionality,
mm,
and talking about power dynamics and
mm,
power relations. And, Morocco is a predominantly Muslim country.
mm,
And so we actually take them on a trip to the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, to a mosque
mm,
out in Redmond. They've been great. We've taken lots of SPU students there just so that they can be able to be in a mosque for the first time without it being for the first time in Morocco, so they can ask questions. And we have someone there who goes over Islam with them and how some of those different misconceptions are. And so it's an exciting way for them to also see some of the overlap with the Abrahamic faiths as
mm,
well. A lot of them aren't exposed to that. And so that's exciting for them. And to understand some of the things that might be more offensive in that culture, like putting your feet up in front of somebody, for instance, like that's not okay. So putting them in situations where they can like practice
mm.
almost is very helpful for them. And it helps ease their anxiety as well.
Mm,
So we do like a global seminar type of course that's not really for credit, but it's where we meet once a week
mm,
to go over questions, talk about cultural differences, and review some of the things that they might be apprehensive about,
mm,
but also encouraging them to go in with curiosity. We often talk about the white savior
mm,
complex, right? And that it can be prominent in a mission trip setting. But to go into a place being the curious one, being the student, and allowing the people that are there to show you what they want to show you.
mm,
And that's something that we love doing with the homestays as well.
mm,
And with the language exchange with college students, is that they're walking alongside people who live there and letting them show them how they live their lives every day.
mm.
And that's why it's nice to be in Meknes for 2 weeks because they learn how to live in a place without, just doing all these, tours
Right.
every day. So they're
Mhm.
able to navigate the market. They learn how to cook. They do a cooking class and just to be able to immerse themselves in the culture
Mm,
without any pressure to fit in a whole bunch of stuff all at once.
right. Yeah. Wow. That once a week preparation class. So am I hearing correctly that that happens in the States before you go to Morocco?
Yes, that you we just set up a little 1 hour
Mm,
uh, course on Canvas. It doesn't count for credit or anything, but it's just to prepare them ahead of time. So we do everything from packing and
mhm,
talking about what's appropriate to wear in Morocco versus in the United States.
mhm,
This is also something we would do. So we had a few students who identify as non-binary.
mm,
Had to talk about those kinds of situations, and
mm,
because that's not something that is accepted in
mm,
Morocco in certain sexual forms of sexuality or
mm.
expressions of sexuality. So all of these things are things that you might not think, oh, we should probably address that before we go, and being able to have those one-on-one conversations with them as well. And also introducing them to the foods because that's also something that can be kind of challenging for
Right.
some of them.
But I love the idea of utilizing something like Canvas so that students can watch on their own, right? And keep up with the materials because I I too teach South Korea study abroad in the fall, like the pre-fall. Is it the September term? I forget
Yes.
what we call
Yeah.
it now, the September term. And so summertime is typically when I would want my students to sort of be active in learning about Korea, but it's been really hard to get them to attend Zoom sessions. And so these
Mhm.
recordings, these modules, I'm making mental notes about how helpful that might be. And I also wonder, Sarah, about how across programs there might be modules that we can share. So, for instance, the example that you gave about non-binary students and how they can navigate countries where so that they can be safe. They can be safe and what to expect and all these things I think can be so helpful to be shared across different contexts, realizing that of course each country is different, but there might be some overlaps that could be helpful.
Definitely. Or even just talking about cultural appreciation versus cultural
Yeah,
appropriation, things like
right.
that.
Yeah. I I mean, now that you brought that up, Sarah, like how do you explain that to students? Because and to give you maybe something to maybe respond to or also think about, in my program, students have a day, like their orientation day in Korea includes going to this place where they try on traditional Korean clothing, and it's called hanbok. And it's a very common sighting in Korea where tourists wear hanbok, like foreigners, and the readily identifiable foreigners wearing hanbok, walking around, taking selfies, taking pictures. And so I usually students are open to this experience, but sometimes students have been unsure about it. And so I've always sort of wrestled with how to explain appreciation versus appropriation so that students feel like they can, with good conscience, engage in this activity. So how do you, yeah, explain this to students? Yeah.
Well, I do try. I
Yeah.
try to explain it to
Right.
students, but being in Morocco and having a very specific opportunity was very helpful.
Mm,
So one of the things that the students get to do is get like henna tattoos, is how we
mm,
would call them in the States, or like
mhm.
mainly,
Right.
right? And the students, some of them are doing social justice or cultural studies.
Mhm.
And they approached me and they said, is it okay for us to do this?
Mm.
Which I genuinely appreciate that they're
Yeah.
concerned about it. And I said, if there is someone within a culture who's inviting you
Yeah.
into an experience with them,
Right.
there's nothing wrong with that.
Mm,
It's you appreciating that they're inviting you into that experience. Appropriation is more taking the
mm,
experience away from the culture.
mhm,
That like what's the word I'm looking for? Like colonial tourism,
mhm.
where you take something back and own it as your own, and own it or recreate it into something that it wasn't originally.
Right.
But when they were with some of the other college students, they love to dress them up and
Mhm,
go get the mehendi done with them. And that's the difference, is that
mhm.
if there's a person in a culture inviting you to be a part of that experience,
Mm.
it's almost rude not to
Right, right,
not to
right.
engage,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, and when I explained it to them in that way,
Mm,
everyone was okay with going,
mhm.
because I would say maybe 50% of the students weren't going to go,
Mm.
because they felt uncomfortable about it.
Yeah, yeah. I would imagine, especially in that major, there's a lot of awareness and sensitivity in a way that, yeah, I'm glad that they talked to you about it. And I took mental notes, Sarah, as you're explaining that. But this idea of being invited into the culture, I think that's an important distinction. And then also your motivation for engaging in that behavior, like getting a tattoo, wearing the traditional clothing. Why are you doing that? I think that is also an important question to ask.
And one of the
Yeah.
things that I especially wanted them to take away from that is, well, sometimes I think it's difficult to be in the United States and understand that,
Mm,
because there is so much appropriation that
right.
occurs in the United States. But when you are in country, I think it's a lot easier to appreciate,
Hmm.
as opposed to feeling like you're taking something, because
Right.
the people are sharing something with
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. And I think my students, they were in some ways validated when they put on the hanbok and then they had all these elderly Koreans approach them and say, "Oh, how beautiful." And then maybe even go up to them and touch the hanbok and stuff like that. So I think they felt at ease when those interactions happened.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I love it when the people who are in the culture would just, fawn over them and
Yeah.
love seeing them dressed in traditional clothing or with the
Hmm.
tattoos, or even just like eating their food. I feel like they feel appreciated and
Hmm.
seen in that way too. And
Right.
not like these are Americans who come in to see the sights and then go eat at McDonald's. Right.
Right. Right. Yeah. Exactly. We both teach at a Christian institution where we are encouraged to think about our motivation for doing what we do from a Christian perspective. And I'm curious if you're willing to share what is your motivation as a Christian scholar in doing study abroad? How would you articulate that? And during the study abroad, how do you go about doing faith integration?
So, a lot of the motivation for why I study, why I do the research I do or teach the classes that I do, is actually a very personal one.
Hmm.
My father, he is an immigrant. He's originally from Kuwait. He used to be a Muslim. He used to be an imam,
Hmm.
and he's actually a pastor now. And one of the really big things, especially post 9/11, there was a lot of hatred and discrimination against Muslims or anybody who was perceived to be Muslim. There was a lot of dissent coming there and a lot of fear.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I saw my dad do is he went around to different churches and did these different like workshops or talks explaining exactly what Islam is,
Hmm.
and how some of the things that we see in news media or entertainment media are at the extremes,
Hmm.
in the same way that you see extremes for any religion ideology.
Right.
And being able to break down those barriers and talk more about how to love your neighbor.
Mm,
And I think promoting those kinds of messages and breaking down that framing and just seeing this person as another creature of God is really important.
mm,
And I talk to my students about this a lot, but then one of the number one reasons behind Islamophobia is ignorance. People just don't know very much about it.
right.
And so I do think that media is a huge perpetuator of these terrible narratives. And so a lot of the research that I do is embedded in that.
Mm,
And it comes up in my teaching all the time.
right.
And that's one of the reasons why before we go to Morocco, we do take them to a mosque, and not just for a service. We have somebody who gives us a tour, and they provide us with food. They make a lunch for us. They do a Q&A with us. And I think it just breaks down this barrier
Mm,
where we can interact and love each other. And I
mm,
firmly believe that that's at the core of what Christianity is. And so that bleeds into my teaching naturally.
mhm, mhm. Wow, that's so powerful. And I've heard you share that testimony about your family before, but just to be able to bring in your experiences, right, into your teaching and that extension of your faith into the classroom, that's so powerful and so compelling. So thank you for sharing that. One time when I was doing a South Korea study abroad, a student approached me and asked about how do you become a Buddhist? The student became so interested in, after all the temple visits, in
Mhm.
Buddhism in a way that, like, when she asked the question, I felt a moment of panic because I didn't know enough about Buddhism to be able to sort of meaningfully answer that question. And so that was like a moment when I felt like, oh, like I should really do a little bit more or maybe a lot more research into the sites that we're visiting and not just treat it as, oh, this is a Buddhist temple. It's a very historically meaningful thing in Korea, but also to be able to answer those questions in a way that's satisfactory to students. Like, have you ever had those moments where students were interested, for instance, in Islam? And I'm sure that you have the wealth of knowledge, but interested in like even like what how would you respond to a question like how do I convert? Those kinds of questions. Sorry, I
Um,
know this wasn't a planned question, but as you were sharing, I just thought about my experience and wanted to ask you. Yeah.
I mean, it's a really good question. And thinking about you asking it, I don't know that I would be dissimilar from you.
Mm,
I understand what Islam is, but I don't, teach it. So I don't know
mhm,
how, I don't know if I would be,
mm,
if I could give an adequate answer,
mm.
but I'm just trying to think.
No worries. Take your time. I know I threw a very difficult question at you. I One thing I thought about was like, oh, like if I know other friends, scholars who
Mhm.
are more knowledgeable in this area, who are maybe Buddhists and can provide their own experiences, maybe that could be a route that I could introduce to this kind of a conversation. Yeah.
Because it's so interesting because
Mm,
I'm coming from the reverse, right?
mm, mm.
Where a Muslim became a Christian as opposed to a
Right.
Christian becoming a Muslim.
Right. Right.
And honestly, I think that people convert for lots of different reasons.
Sure.
And one of them I know that's very popular is interreligious marriages. It's
Mm,
easier for one of the people in the marriage to convert, to make it easier for their children, to make it easy on them. I know that when my parents first got married, the plan was for her to convert, but she said
mm,
no. So we ended up going the other way around. But I think that it's interesting. I mean, as far as like how to become a Muslim, I mean, it depends on the sect as well. It's not a
mm.
monolith.
Right.
And but when it comes down to it, I think it's a person who's searching for meaning and for
Mm,
God.
right.
And wherever that ends up taking you, I mean, my father became a Christian while he was looking for a deeper connection with God in Islam,
Wow.
and that's how that happened.
Mhm.
So, I don't know, but
Yeah.
I agree. I think maybe it would be helpful to reach out to somebody who had a different experience.
Yeah. I just remember also feeling like here I was teaching at a Christian higher ed institution, and now I'm getting a student asking with genuine interest, how do I embrace Buddhism as my religion? And I just remember sort of this, and maybe because of my own biases and my own life experiences, where I just felt really inadequate in being able to answer that question. Given that I gave you a really difficult question, next one I think is a fun one, and that's for the study abroad. If you had to pick one excursion or an activity as your favorite, maybe you have multiple favorites, but if you had to pick one, what would it be?
This is a very easy question for me to
Mm,
answer. It is the desert. It is going into the Mirzuga Desert.
yeah.
First of all, when you're out there, so a lot of Hollywood movies that look like they're based in the Middle East and wherever that is are filmed in Morocco.
Mm,
So it's a gorgeous desert. And while it sounds very touristy, seeing students get on a camel or like slide down the dunes, it's just so fun to see them see something for the first time.
wow.
So there's that. But then there's the camping part.
Mm,
So they set up a camp, it's rustic, but it's not too rustic.
okay.
And you have your different tents and they have all of these like rugs and, Moroccan paraphernalia and it's super
Mm,
colorful. And the students don't have any electricity.
mm.
And that's very hard for them. And I just remember there was a couple of really interesting questions that came up. One was, where do we charge our phones? And we had go over the fact that there was nowhere to charge your phone,
Right.
but it was going to be okay.
Mm,
The second was, where do we use the bathroom?
mm.
So the person, our tour guide who was with us throughout the trip, she made a joke, but the students didn't realize it was a joke. She said, you know how cats, dig in the litter? That's how you do it in the desert. And
Oh my
obviously
goodness.
that's not true.
Oh,
They set
yeah.
up a
Right.
bathroom and it's very nice and
Mm,
wonderful. And so at night you have this e extravagant feast of food. There was always so much food.
mm,
And what was really kind too is that we did have some vegetarian
mm.
or vegan students who agreed to be vegetarian for the trip,
Right.
and they made accommodations for that. And just sitting and breaking bread with them.
Wow.
And then after the meal, you sit around a fire, and some of the Moroccans who are with us will play instruments and tell
Mm,
stories. And it's
wow.
just such a beautiful experience where you're really disconnected and it's just you and the desert and the people that you're with.
Right.
And everyone's like on an equal footing at that
Yeah.
point.
Right. I mean, we talk about unplugging here, but that sounds like a very different type of a different level, another level of unplugging. And I imagine for this generation of students, not having phone access for a night or so is scary, but also what a powerful experience for them. Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Wow. Now you're making me want to go on that trip, right?
It's
Um,
it's one of the best part. It's
mm,
where you really feel like, I'm not in Kansas anymore.
right.
I'm in the desert.
Yeah. Literally in
And
the
it's
desert.
something that
Mhm.
local Moroccans do too when they just
Mm,
wanna get away and unplug as they go out to the desert.
okay. What's the climate like at that time?
So, so in the winter, so
Mm,
we were there in December, it can get quite chilly. It can be
okay.
very cold. So
Mm,
at night in the desert especially, it gets very cold.
mm,
So, they have plenty of blankets and
I see.
we always tell them to, layer, but it can be very chilly when the sun goes down.
Got it. Got it. If I so I don't have students sleeping outside in Korea, but one experience that I would pick as my favorite is the DMZ visit, the demilitarized zone visit, where depends on the political climate, but some years, or actually one year, we were not only able to visit the DMZ, but also within the DMZ, there's a very they call it the JSA, Joint Security Area. That's a high sort of heavily guarded area by the UN soldiers, right? Where It's literally where Trump went, right? And Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, met Trump. That area is sometimes open to the public, and we happened to be in Korea during a time when it was open. It's no longer open because of the political climate, the tensions, but it was amazing for students to be able to literally step into that area and even like go to an area where one side of the table was considered North Korea and the other side was South Korea. And you see the North Korean soldiers like just a few hundred feet away. And yeah, it was just a very different experience for students who you mentioned the media sort of feeding us these narratives, a very different sort of feeling regarding the North and South Korea dynamic when we're there. So I would pick the DMZ visit as my favorite. Yeah.
I imagine that that would be very powerful. My husband knows that if I could only go to one more country, it would be South Korea.
Mm,
That's very high on my list, and we both would really like to go to the DMZ just to.
mm,
I imagine that there's a certain feeling or just something when you're there and you see it all for yourself.
mhm.
That is something that you can't teach. Can't you have to experience it.
Yeah, exactly. I think the narrative in the media, Western media, is North Korea is all bad, is the enemy. But when you're there at the DMZ, you understand sort of the emotional aspect of all of this, that the Korea as one country literally got divided into two, and there's this pain that is associated with the North and South Koreas.
Mhm.
Do you have a compelling story, fun story that stays in your mind about a student experience? I'm sure you have many again, but is there a student anecdote that you're willing to share?
Well,
Mm,
I don't know if it's a specific student as much as it was just a very specific experience that
mm,
I don't know that we'll ever get this experience again.
mm,
So when we were in Morocco in December of 2022, it was during the World Cup,
mm.
and Morocco
They did
was
so well. Yeah.
that was the furthest like an
Yeah.
African country had gone, and so it
Mhm.
was so exciting.
Mm,
And I think that that was a layer that really heightened the whole experience for
mm,
them
mhm.
and also like enmeshed them in Moroccan culture.
Wow.
Like it was completely normal for us to go into the coffee because there's coffee shops and people drink coffee all day to go into coffee shops and watch the games
Yeah.
alongside these a lot of old men.
Mm,
But as soon as Morocco would win in the streets, everyone was out in the streets praising God, and there was tons of music
mm,
and just everybody shouting and hugging, and everybody
wow.
was just one with each other
Mm,
and like embracing Morocco. And I just remember we were on our way to the desert and it was one of the qualifying games and Morocco was playing and they won
mm.
and our bus got stopped because there were so many people in the street
Ah,
celebrating. Yeah. So I I just know that that was a very big experience
mhm,
for them to be able to have that.
mhm,
There is another thing that the group does,
mm,
but I'm not super sure. I mean, I can tell you what it is and you can do what you want with it. They go to a hammam
mm.
separately without us. And a hammam, it's a lot like having a body scrub, right?
Ah, mm,
And so you go in there and you really have to be very vulnerable because you're
sure.
going in there for a body scrub, right? And one of this was by far I heard story after story from students, particularly a female students or female presenting student, that they would go in there and there's so much body dysmorphia and body issues
Mm,
around the world.
mhm,
But
mhm,
they were just going in there to get clean because it's usually like an older Moroccan woman who's just
mm,
giving you a bath basically and a nice scrub. And they said, nobody was looking at me.
mm,
Nobody was. judging me. I was literally in there with every other Moroccan woman
Mhm.
getting my
Yeah.
weekly clean.
Mm.
And I had students who wrote, a couple of students who wrote poetry about it,
Yeah.
their journal reflections. So many of them, they came back in tears because they felt
Mm.
so pure. Like I think one of them described it was like being a baby again,
Wow.
where they were just there and nobody cared what they looked like. Nobody was watching them because I think one woman said she looked at I wasn't there. The
Mm.
students go by themselves, and she said this Moroccan woman who was maybe a bigger woman, she looked at the girl and she looked at herself and she goes, "You and me, we are the same. We
Oh,
are
wow.
beautiful."
Wow.
That was by far the most
Mm.
powerful one of the most powerful things for them, for sure.
I'm so glad you shared that, Sarah, because I literally got chills because in my program, the students have done something similar.
Mhm.
Like it's optional, obviously, because I don't want to require students to go, but Korea has an equivalent, which is they call it 찜질방, or literally means like heated rooms, but there is a bath area where uh, it's divided by biological sex, and there is body scrubbing. But the students reflected on, and this is the part that gave me chill when you shared, in their writing, they reflected on the fact that on one hand, Korea is, as a society, really obsessed with how one looks. There's a lot of emphasis placed on clothing, and it's almost considered rude to not dress up in public. But on the other hand, in that setting of the public bathhouse, like everyone was the same. Like they literally reflected on that and how just nobody was looking at them. Just it was like the normal thing to do and how powerful that experience was. So I think this is another sort of experience where your trip, my trip, different countries, but very similar
Mhm.
experiences that students are
Mhm.
reflecting on. Right? Yeah.
Well, like I said,
Um,
it's optional. They
right.
don't have to do it, and some students opted not to do it
Yeah.
because they weren't comfortable, and that's fine.
Right, right, right.
But every student who did wrote about it. Every
Yeah,
single one wrote
yeah.
about it, how powerful it was for them.
Yeah, and my students went as a small group. So by the way, not all students did it, but they
Right.
just went off like as a small group. And so even that bonding experience with one another, that was so powerful. And they reflected on that in their writing. How about, and this is going to require, I think, us to be extra vulnerable, but if we could share like a story of a quote unquote fail. And what I mean by that, of course, is something that we kind of laugh about now, but at the moment it was really maybe challenging to deal with, or yeah, I are you willing to share a story? Because I have so many, but I want to hear yours, Sarah, regarding something that, wow, like it was really hard at that time, but now I kind of chuckle about it.
So I think I'm going to disappoint you, Paul, to be
Mm.
honest, because well, I saw the question. I've been
Mm,
thinking about it and thinking about it, and I don't know that I have something that's like
okay.
really
Mm,
convicting as opposed to so leading a study abroad, as I'm sure you know, can be very exhausting. It's
mm,
also very rewarding, but it is very tiring.
mm,
And I had one particular student who really liked to share her poems with me, her
mm,
reflections with me, asking me questions about the lectures, about the culture. But there was a lot of it. There was a whole lot of it,
mm,
to the point where, it was preventing me from interacting with any of the other students.
right.
And I kid you not, this was probably the most challenging thing that we had to deal with is how do you continue to fuel that curiosity
Mm,
without draining yourself?
sure.
And also, again, making yourself available to other students.
Mm,
That was a very challenging situation
sure.
because I didn't know how to navigate.
Right.
Apart from that, the bathroom situation was very difficult for my
Mm,
students. They
mm,
just if they and it's something we talked about beforehand, but if there was not a traditional Western toilet,
mm,
they would rather get a bladder infection.
mm,
And you know, there's only so much that you can do with that. And I very much felt like, like a soccer mom in a van, because they'd be like, Dr. Shaban, is this a like a real potty or is it, a hole in the ground?
Mm,
And I've never been there, so I don't know. I don't know
mm,
what kind of bathroom is there. And I one of our excursions after we
mhm,
finish through the desert, we go to a boarding school.
mm,
And it's a girls boarding school, and they stay there. And one of the things that we have to do is bring our own water.
mm,
Buying like big jugs of waters, it's fairly inexpensive.
mhm.
And I remember there was a student, very bright, wasn't really expecting this coming from this particular student, but she said, "I don't understand why they're not providing water for us."
Oh, wow. Mm,
And again, it was one of those moments where I'm like, this is a teaching moment.
mhm, mhm.
I have to navigate this. She's like, it would just make more sense if they provided the water, if they just like had water bottles for us there.
Wow.
And,
Yeah. Yeah.
it was just a weird thing to navigate,
Mhm, mhm.
and to highlight issues of privilege,
Right,
right? And
right.
it was like little moments like that
Yeah,
between bathrooms and bottled water, that it was little things like that, but
yeah.
having to figure out how to talk about it in a way that's teaching and not being judgmental.
Right, right. Oh, those are
I'd
great
love to hear some of your story.
those are great examples, Sarah, though, because I think study abroad introduces these unique elements where, I mean, we might have these interactions on campus, but not as likely that students will be asking us about bathrooms, that students will be making comments about water, those kinds of things. So it's these sort of everyday interactions that sort of build up during study abroad to sometimes be really stressful, especially because we as faculty might be feeling isolated, lonely, homesick, right? And so I appreciated those examples. For me, like, yeah, when I think about a fail experience, fail as in like I kind of laugh about it now, but it made me really uncomfortable. I took students, and this was an optional activity, but I took them to a mega church in Korea. Not because I was aligned with their theology, but because, hey, this is literally the biggest church in the world in terms of the numbers. It's the full gospel church in Yeouido, Seoul, Korea. And like they have English translations. It's really a very touristy kind of an experience, but also educational as well. But happened to be the sermon was full of like cringy moments where there's a lot of like praising America, equating Christianity with white culture. And I just remember like my heart sinking and thinking about, I hope my students don't think that this is Korean Christianity. So we had to do a lot of processing afterwards. But that was a fail moment because the one sort of mega church that we visited, the what came out of the pulpit then was really not something that I wanted my students to hear. Yeah.
That sounds very awkward. Not going to
Yes.
lie. It sounds like a very
Thank
awkward experience.
thank you for
But also
validating that. Yeah.
the catalyst to have like this bigger conversation
Yeah.
about these narratives of Christianity that are being exported out,
Yeah.
essentially, which could be very interesting, but cringy and awkward nonetheless, for sure.
Yes. Yes. Because I wasn't necessarily walking into it expecting it. But you're right that in retrospect, there was a door open for talking about cross-cultural missions, colonialism, white supremacy, all these things that still play out globally. I'm also trying to think about maybe a lighter example in Korea and maybe in Morocco. There might be some overlap in this experience, but in Korea, the sense of personal space is not very it's not clear. There's the public space oftentimes becomes the personal space. So Edward Hall's model where there's public space, personal space, private space, all of this is very much blurred in South Korea. And my very respectful American students, they would insist upon personal space in subways. And so they would literally
I see.
like walk in with a maybe arm's length away between them and the person in front of them. But I would then have to literally tell them, if you do that here, you might miss the subway. The door might close on you. Or if you insist upon giving people space, you might actually be disrespectful to other people who are using the subway. And so the respectful thing to do is to be actually really close to the other person. And they had such trouble with that. And understandably so, because you're literally having to do the opposite of what you're used to. But
Right.
yeah.
Right.
In Morocco, do you use the public transportation much? And when you do so, have you seen similar themes? Yeah.
Public transportation isn't really a thing.
Okay.
There, I mean, in the sense, except for the fact there are more like joint taxis. So
Mm,
there's like a
yeah.
van,
Yeah.
and they'll take multiple people
Right.
in,
Right.
and you sit next to whoever's there,
Yeah.
and you don't make a fuss about it.
Right. Right.
And that's that. Or, maybe there's too many people in this van, but this is just what we're doing. This is how
Yeah.
we're getting from point A to point
Right.
B.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Like you make room for people if
exactly.
they fit more
Right.
people in. Yeah. Hmm.
Right. It's
Yeah.
not, there's no room here. No,
Yeah.
there's always room.
Right. Yeah. Wow, these are amazing stories. Just to sort of close the loop on study abroad, do you have any advice for academics who are starting out in higher education who are wanting to lead a study abroad program?
My biggest thing is meeting students where they're.
Mm,
I think sometimes we have these really high expectations for where we want students to be, even before we get on the ground to wherever we're going.
right.
And there's going to be mess ups, and
Mm,
people are going to do things that we were very clear that they weren't supposed to do.
right.
And to 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 give them the benefit of the doubt, and
Mm,
to come at it from a place of kindness, and showing them that this is a way to learn about the world.
mm,
But I think that it's important to meet them where they're.
yeah,
And I think that's a big part of meeting with them ahead of time before you get there, is to know what page everyone's on,
right.
what to look out for, where I'm going to need to maybe hold their hand a little bit,
Mm,
just so that they learn the most,
yeah.
honestly, and have the best experience, while also not, being disrespectful to anybody at the same
Mm-hmm.
time.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I echo your advice about meeting students where they are. And for me as instructor, I grew in my empathy of my study abroad students when I looked at my own children who are now middle school years,
Mhm.
but they love visiting Korea with me. But by the end of the trip, there's a certain level of stress that they express to me about being in a country where they don't understand the language. They see people who are similar to them, but still, like, this is not their home. And just being in a country where people are speaking and writing and reading a language that they don't understand is incredibly stressful for them. And so observing them allowed me to grow in my empathy of my own students as well and meeting them where they might be. Sarah, just amazing to chat with you about study abroad. I also have three questions that I ask all guests on the podcast. So the first question is, what is one thing that you're working on currently that most excites you? So a chance for you to introduce what you're working on currently.
So right now I am working on a research project where I'm interviewing journalists who are part of the Iranian diaspora. So the diaspora really intrigues me, because you have this person who's caught in between two worlds, or maybe even more than two, depending on their identity,
Yeah.
and how they think about telling the story of where they come from
Mm,
to an audience, primarily a Western audience. So I do
mhm,
this from the perspective of Iran,
mm,
and talking to Iranian diaspora journalists who are covering the protests back home, and how to explain
wow.
that to the United States
Mm,
specifically. And the United States and Iran have geopolitical tensions,
right.
and what does that do inside of them? How do they wrestle with that?
Mm,
How do they feel like do they feel like being a part of the diaspora enhances their ability to do their job, or does it actually bring them down a little bit?
mm,
Um, and those interviews were some of the most powerful stories I've heard. And it also helped me feel seen. Just, I'm a daughter of immigrants, but also feeling caught between the countries that my parents come from and then also living here.
mm,
And I think that we need to shine more light on this group of people because
mhm,
especially in the United States, we're seeing more and more of that. And, by 2050, I feel like we'll have a very, very diverse population where
mm,
we'll have lots of people from the diaspora, lots of people from mixed backgrounds.
mm,
And I'm just interested in how journalism is shifting with that particular group of people.
mm. Ah, that's amazing work. Is it challenging to find the right sample size? Or
So,
yeah, mhm, yeah,
so I do qualitative work. I
yeah,
do
yeah.
qualitative critical work. So I don't
Mm,
get by any means, 100 participants.
right, right,
And particularly, I had to do anonymous interviews because it is Iran.
right.
And so some of these journalists wouldn't be able to return home, or, that there's a lot of safety precautions that need to
Mhm,
be taken. So it was actually very difficult to get the sample size that I got because, well, it was really a lot of snowball sampling. You have to
right.
rely on one person to
Yeah,
say, oh, I trust her.
yeah.
It's okay. She'll take care of you.
Mhm,
And I think not I mean, I think being part of the diaspora myself really was helpful. I think there's almost like an unspoken, like, bond between people when you know that.
yeah,
But it is definitely challenging for sure.
mhm, yeah, yeah, and I hope that people who engage your scholarship will recognize that, right? How much work you put into those networks and how certainly you being part of the diaspora is helpful, but also there's so much work involved in recruiting samples like this compared to, say, the sophomore class in psychology here. And so I hope people will recognize the work that you're putting into that kind of recruitment. I know you gave advice for study abroad folks, but I'm curious about because now you've had experience in Christian higher ed for many years. If you had one advice for new faculty or even an advanced graduate student who's thinking about Christian higher education, what might it be? I know, and I also recognize that this is a very loaded question that we could go multiple ways, right? But if you had one advice for someone who's thinking about Christian higher ed.
So, I don't know if it comes from me being a former journalist and
Mm,
therefore a storyteller.
mm,
I have a PhD. I can bring the research in, I can bring the academia
mm,
into higher education. But I really see what shines through with my students is when I share my experiences and from my own life. I never ask my students to do anything I'm not willing to do.
mm,
And I'm very discussion based in my classes. And we have people at Seattle Pacific who come from multiple faith backgrounds.
right.
And I want everyone to feel like they have the space to engage in the conversation.
Mm,
And so if I'm vulnerable with them, I have always seen them be vulnerable in return.
mm,
So I think sharing a little bit of yourself with your students can go a long way
mm,
in creating a really meaningful space that enriches the learning in a lot
mm,
of ways. When I read some of, the evaluations, one of the things that I see recurring is that students felt like they learned almost the most when we were in
mm,
group discussion because they learned about the different experiences that other people were
mm,
having that they didn't even know were happening. And and relating that, of course, to the material that's being taught has been
right.
helpful. So storytelling, I think, is very powerful.
Mm, yeah, that's really good. And we all do storytelling in different ways depending on our disciplines, but certainly you have such rich experiences professionally and personally that you could bring into the storytelling. My last question is it can be a really deep one or a fun one, but without knowing who my next guest is, and I truly don't know off the top of my head, what question might you ask my next guest? And also, if you're curious about my last guest who was on the podcast, this person asked, you are standing at a crossroad. What do you want to do? Where would each option take you? Where would each option take you? And so you can start by maybe answering that question if you would like. And then what kind of a question might you throw at the next guest?
Your guest really threw a deep question out there.
He did, yeah.
Well, I think what really came to mind when I first heard the question
Mm.
is actually what brought me to academia in the first place. So becoming a teacher, professor was never the plan. Not even when I went to go get my PhD. That was
Really?
never
Wow.
the plan.
Mm.
I was going to go and work for a research think tank. That was my plan.
Okay.
And as part of my fellowship, I had to teach.
Mm.
And when I was teaching, I fell in love with it. I had so much fun. And I thought that, I built a good rapport with the students. And I thought, oh, I think I could like this. So I do see myself still sometimes at that crossroads. Do I want to, do like public policy research and dive all in there? Or do I want to continue to teach?
Right.
Which way do I want to go?
Mm.
So I don't know which way I want to go, but right now I'm doing the joint option.
Right.
So we'll see. Maybe later on down the road, every time I think, oh yeah, maybe I should go back down the research road, I know how much I would miss my students. I honestly get so excited to go to the classroom and see them and listen to them, and I feel like I would miss that a lot.
Yeah.
So maybe I decided already. I guess that was the crossroads.
And I hear amazing things from students who take your classes.
Oh, that's kind.
Any question from a next guest?
Yes, I'm going to give your next guest a fun one. This is a question I think that genuinely can tell you a lot about a person that maybe you wouldn't know, even if you've been friends with this person for years. If they were to write a piece of fiction, what would the storyline be?
Oh, that's really good. Okay. Yeah. We will just leave
And
it
I've
at
heard
that.
some interesting ones. I've heard some really interesting ones.
Yeah. Wow. That's a good one. I might use it with my students if you're okay with that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for offering that. Sarah, it's so amazing to chat with you today. I feel like I learned so much from you. I want to hear more stories after future trips if they happen.
I want to hear more stories about your trips to Korea.
It's happening this year, so I'm in the thick of preparing for it. And as you know, there's a lot going on our campus, and so it does sort of contribute to it being a very atypical experience. But yeah, I'm in the thick of preparing for it. So happy to share my thoughts as well. Do you have anything else, Sarah, that you'd like to share before we stop the record button?
No, you're a very good host. I thought you asked excellent questions. Coming from a former journalist, I'm telling you, this was a really great interview.
That means a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you'll join us next time.
I encourage students to eat Korean food when they're in Korea, but I also give them grace when, like, I've had students, they would say, oh, Professor Kim, I caved and I went to Taco Bell or I went to McDonald's. And I say, it's okay. You need to take a break from time to time. So
that's fair. I remember when I went to Morocco for the first time, not for study abroad, but my husband and I definitely went to Pizza Hut one day. And and I think that being vulnerable with them on that level too is helpful for them.
And Pizza Hut can taste very different outside
This
of
is
the
also
US.
true.
Yeah.
This is also true.
So it is a cross-cultural
They're not
experience.
serving pork.